This is a video presentation of On the Road to Better Games, how UX professionals are driving the games industry forward. My name is David Lightbound. I'm the User Experience Director for the UX team, which is part of the technology group at Ubisoft. And I've been developing games for over 15 years now. I've spoken on the topic of user experience in the games industry at various conferences around the world, including MIGS, GDC, IGDA events, SIGGRAPH, and the Game UX Summit. And in 2015, I published a book entitled Designing the User Experience of Game Development Tools. Now, you may have heard the term user experience before. At GDC in 2017, there was an entire day, an entire summit dedicated to user experience topics in the games industry and user experience of games themselves. The IGDA SIG Games User Research has been going on for many, many years, and every year in California, they have a conference called the GUR Conference, the Games User Research Conference. And just recently, last year, there was a Game UX Summit started by Epic Games in North Carolina. They had a conference, the first Game UX Summit on the East Coast, and in 2017, it's going to be hosted by Ubisoft Toronto. Now, many people who work in not just the industries like games, but in other industries as well, when they think about what success looks like, sometimes it looks like as you're going towards success, you take a path, and either you choose one way, which leads to failure, or you go another way, which leads to success. But the reality is that success doesn't really work that way. It works a little bit more like this. Getting to success is a question of a series of miniature failures or learning experiences that lead you down the right path to success. It's not just choosing one way or the other. It's a series of learning experiences to lead you towards success. And that's one of the things that interests Ubisoft a lot, and that's one of the reasons why we have a user research lab, or several user research labs around the world, most notably in Dusseldorf and in Montreal, but in others around the world as well. And other game developers such as EA and Activision also have user research labs that they use to learn about their games. How does that work typically? Well, in this example here, which is from the User Research Lab in Ubisoft Toronto, what happens is that people will be brought in to play games, and they will be observed playing the games so that we can get a better understanding of what they like and what they don't like. And that's the player experience. And it's something that we can't really control. We try to make a game that is something that's interesting for people, but their experience is going to be their experience. And we try to make it as positive as possible. But we have the only way to understand what their experience is to observe it. And the reason why we do this is this: without doing this any sort of observation, it's possible that we could develop a game and then it ships to market and it doesn't sell very well and it doesn't justify the investment. And we realize retrospectively that there were things in the game that people didn't like, but we didn't know about it until we shipped the game. What we try to do with this research lab is to try to get a better understanding before we ship, a better understanding of what people think of the game, so that we can try to get an opportunity to correct those things. So we can do iterations on the game to try to make it better. Now, that brings us to help us to make iterations, that brings us to a better product, and then that hopefully will result in making a profit by understanding what the game is missing and trying to make iterations on it to improve the game. Which brings us to another aspect of user experience, which is the one I want to talk to you about today, which is not necessarily about the player experience, but the developer experience. Now, whenever our game developers use any of our tools and pipelines and engines, they also have an experience as well, a positive or a negative experience. And also they are more or less productive depending upon their situation and the tool. So they are attempting to do these iterations on the things that were identified by the User Research Lab. And what we want to try to do in the work that I do at Ubisoft is to try to help people have a more positive developer experience so that they can do as many iterations as possible before we ship, and not just one or two. And hopefully that will result in a significantly better game, which will result in more profit. And user experience professionals who work in this field, there are lots of different things that they can contribute to the games industry in regards to improving the developer experience. And I want to talk to you about two today. The first is finding opportunities, and the second is prioritizing solutions. Let's talk about finding opportunities first. Now, the games industry has been around since, I would say, in terms of when it really ramped up, I would say in the 1980s with the release of the NES. but it really hasn't been around for that long if you really take things into consideration. And there is another industry that has been around for way longer than the games industry, and that is the automotive industry. And if you consider one of the first gasoline-powered cars being in 1886, that was around the time that the industry really started to ramp up. And then especially a big explosion in the early 1900s with Henry Ford and the Model T. So that industry has been around for a lot longer, and they have had more time to figure out some of the best ways to make the people who work at their companies as productive as possible, so that they can make the best products possible and pass that value over to the customer. And one of those companies that comes to mind immediately, of course, is Toyota. And Toyota has been around for a long time, and they have developed a lot of different techniques to try to improve their process as much as possible. And one of those things, or two of them you may have heard of before, is the Toyota Way or the Toyota Production System. And that has allowed Toyota these techniques to grow incredibly fast. In the 1970s, if you compare their share of the U.S. market from the 1970s to the 2000, they grew 650% in terms of how much market share they were taking in the U.S. It's a huge difference. And again, part of that is part of the TPS, the Toyota Production System, and the Toyota Way. And one of the most important tenets of that is this term, which you'll hear if you read any books on the Toyota Way. You'll hear this term repeated over and over again, Genshi Genbutsu. And what Genshi Genbutsu can be interpreted to mean is this: go and see for yourself. From the plant managers to anybody else who's working in production on these vehicles, go and see for yourself to understand the problem is one of the most important aspects of Toyota's success. And here's a story, an example of that. Now, it's true that Toyota has been incredibly successful, but in 2003, there was another company that was outpacing Toyota in regards to a specific sector, which was the minivan market. In 2003, Toyota had up to that point built a couple of different minivans to try to compete with Toyota's Odyssey, and they were not very successful. One of them was the Previa, the top left, and then the bottom left is the Sienna, which was a very small, not very maneuverable minivan that did not sell very well. So there was a man who was put in the position of chief engineer for the next generation of Toyota Sienna, and he was asked to try to fix these problems. Now, his name is Yuji Yokota. So he was a chief engineer and based out of Japan. Now, he had worked mostly on Japanese vehicles and European vehicles, but he didn't know very much about the North American market. And he was asked to improve the Sienna, which was predominantly focused on the North American and the Canadian market. So, understanding with Genji Genbutsu in mind, what did Mr. Yokota do? Well, he didn't stay in Japan. He decided to get up from his desk and go and see for himself. So he traveled to North America to try to get a better understanding of how the Sienna is used in everyday life. He brought his family with him, and he traveled 85,000 kilometers all across the United States, through every state in the United States, through every province in Canada, and through every province in Mexico. And he tried a variety of different competitors' minivans as well as the Sienna, so that he could go and see for himself to understand exactly how people were using them and what kinds of problems they were confronting. And at different parts of his trip, different important aspects that needed to be improved occurred to him. At one point, he realized when he almost got blown off the road how important all-wheel drive was, or with his children how important comfortable seating was, or having to carry all this stuff, having additional cargo space that's flexible, or a mirror to be able to see what his children are doing in the rear and the back seat. And one of the most significant things that occurred to him, believe it or not, but again, keeping in mind that he comes from Japan and he was not accustomed to the North American market. In Japan, it's very unusual to eat in your car, to eat or drink in your car. Whereas in the United States, the way that people, the transportation that people do, the distances they travel, how often they have to eat in the car is vastly different from the way it is in Japan. So having multiple cup holders and having places to be able to put food was something that he just did not experience and didn't understand. And that was one of the major changes that they did to the Sienna between the two different models. Now, the next year's model of the Sienna took into account all of these changes that Yuji Yokota had observed on his trip. And when that model was released, it was consistently voted as the #1 minivan of the year by a whole variety of different organizations. But a lot of that was because Yuji Yokota went to go and see for himself to really understand the problems that people driving the car were experiencing, and also observing the other people with him to see how they were experiencing the Sienna. Now, Ubisoft also tries to apply this idea of go and see for yourself to our own projects to help us make better tools to improve the developer experience. For example, on the For Honor team, the tools developers there are tools developers, the people who produce the tools, and they are conscious of the fact that they are not content creators, that they have difficulty understanding some of the things that content creators go through. So instead of sitting at their desk and just developing tools from their own perspective, on occasional Fridays, they would take the day off from developing tools, and they would get it from their desk, and they would try to go and understand the experience of the other people who were working in production. And they would effectively, in the same way that Yuji Yokota traveled to North America to understand the experience that he was having, they would spend the day as content creators to try to understand the situation that the content creators were going through by using their tools and by understanding what their challenges were. And this gave them a much better perspective on what sorts of tools were needed and what sorts of things were important to prioritize relative to others. The Watch Dogs team as well had a similar experience in regards to this idea of go and see for yourself. One of the bugs that shipped with Watch Dogs 1 was that the AI, the NPCs, would sometimes drop their umbrellas in the environment, and nobody was really able to figure out where this bug was coming from. And that the animation team had tried over and over again in successive iterations to try to identify where this bug was coming from, and they eventually gave up. It's not a deal breaker at all. The game eventually did sell a very significant number of units, but this was something that the team was never really able to resolve. And how were they able to figure out the solution to this problem? Well, the animation director, the animation technical director, was not the kind of guy who sits at his desk and tries to fix problems from there. He's the kind of guy who gets up from his desk and goes and watches people and understands what their problems are. And this is, for me, is one of the things that makes him one of the best technical directors in the team, is because he really understands the kinds of problems that people are going through. And it occurred to him that the way that people were, animators were trying to debug and identify problems in their animations was with a very technical, text-heavy debugging system that was overlaid on the screen. And this led him to push to get the resources to have an opportunity to develop a new debugging tool, which was called Dissect. Now, what's really cool about Dissect is it's an always-on recorder that's going on in the background. And anytime you spot a bug, you can flip over to Dissect, pause the game, and it'll stop. And then you can use the timeline and scrub back in time and watch the game play backwards in time back to that point where the bug occurred. And then using the bottom left-hand portion of that screenshot, you can use a visual debugger to see exactly where all the animation blends were happening, to try to identify where is this problem occurring, where in the case of the umbrella being dropped or any other problem. And this tool has been one of the most successful tools in terms of adoption within Ubisoft, and it's been spun off to all sorts of other types of debugging, like artificial intelligence and so on. And when the team presented this tool to the Watch Dogs team, in 5 minutes they were able to identify and find and fix that umbrella problem, causing the team to give them a round of applause. They were so impressed. And now, as I said, this tool has been so well received and is so useful that it was used to ship Watch Dogs 2, and it's also currently being used to ship Far Cry 5. Now, there's one limitation, however, to the two examples that I gave you. This idea of Genshi Genbutsu, go and see for yourself. It has worked very well for these teams, but it doesn't always work in all cases. And it's not always possible for a TD to spend time away from their desk because they might have other things that they need to do. And it's not always possible for a tools team to be able to take Fridays off to be able to observe what's going on the floor. Although, again, both of these things are great things for those teams to do when they can. And this is what led the technology group to try to address this problem ourselves, to try to help other teams to go and see for themselves what's going on the production floor. The technology group is a group in Montreal that essentially provides tools and services to all of the different game development teams within Ubisoft. And one of those services that we provide is a user experience service as well, which is the team that I'm on. and we provide that service to the teams to help them find better ways to iterate to help them provide them with tools to help them to iterate more effectively. And one of those examples, the reasons why it's important to have a team like this is something that we saw in Far Cry 5. For example, we were asked to go and look at the situation of how people use source control on Far Cry 5. And so we did what Toyota does so well as well, which is to go and see for yourself. We're going to go and observe people using the tools to understand how they were using source control. In other words, collaborating on files with a tool like Perforce. And one of the things that we observed was when people were working on exporting a model, they would export the model and then they would be asked to check out that file so that they could reserve it to work on it themselves. And they would say, okay. And the thing is, though, is that this model actually is comprised of 3 different files. So they would say okay to that, pop up, and then it would give them another dialog box, and they would click okay on that, and it would give them another one, and they would click on that. And nobody had ever said anything about this because they had become blind to the problem. It had been around for so long that nobody had really said anything. So 2 problems that you often have is that the teams don't have the time to be able to go and see what's going on the floor, but also they become blind to this problem. And that's where having a separate UX team is really, really useful. When people suffer from problem blindness, having an external team without bias, without saying, oh, well, it's always been like that, is really useful. And also doing this sort of reactive research. In other words, going and looking at a workflow as opposed to a specific tool. When we look at a workflow, we're able to identify very high-level problems, as opposed to a specific tool where we can only spot problems in that tool but not see things on a very high level. So if, for example, in the case of Watchdogs and Dissect, if they just looked at their animation tools, they might not have taken a step back and looked at the debugging tools as well and found a better way to debug, as you saw in an example of Dissect. And in the case of the For Honor team, just generally looking at the workflow on a Friday gave them a much better understanding as opposed to only fixing specific problems when they come up. Because people might be blind to those problems, and also because of focusing on a specific workflow or a specific tool too much, doesn't really give you the opportunity to see other problems in the workflow that you might not normally see. So Genshi Genbutsu is something that we try to apply to improve the developer experience, and that means go and see for yourself. And that's one of the ways that the UX team and that user experience professionals can help you find opportunities. Now, the next thing I'd like to talk to you about is prioritizing solutions, how UX professionals help you to prioritize solutions. Now, going back to the automotive industry, some people think that Henry Ford invented the automobile. Now, that's not actually true. Henry Ford did a really good job of perfecting the assembly line and bringing down the cost of a car, but he says himself that he never invented anything. In terms of the gas-powered engine, that often goes to this man called Carl Benz. He's a guy in white in the middle. Now, Carl Benz didn't just invent the car out of thin air. He didn't get a wheel and then 2 wheels and a body and then put that body on the wheels. That's not how things are typically developed. These things happen in a series of very small iterations where you check at each step of the way and make a decision on where you're going to move next. Carl Benz was a mechanical engineer, and he was really interested in bicycles. And he would ride his bicycle to and from work, and he was interested in the mechanical aspect of it. And he always had this dream of developing a motorized bicycle. So he finally got the opportunity to do this one day, working at a new company, and he was able to experiment with different types of motorized bicycles. And he tried different things and made a couple of different decisions with some prototypes and was able to try it out for himself. And then he had a prototype of his motorized bicycle. Now you can imagine that he could also try out different alternatives to that and make different decisions as he was trying it out, and then put 2 motorized bicycles side by side, which, if you attach them together, would lead you to what we now consider, in terms of 4 wheels and 2 seats in the middle, as the modern automobile. And that's often how these things work. It's not just something that you kind of come up with on your own. It's a series of small iterations focusing on a specific goal. And that's one of the things that the user experience team, Ubisoft, helps to do as well, is to help people to develop tools, to help the teams develop tools as well, to iterate on those ideas to try to help them get towards a specific goal, which is to help the users iterate on their on the problems that are identified by the user research lab. Now, to explain how we do that, I'm gonna take a step back and talk about something that you would see, a diagram that you see if you type in the words "how to build an MVP" in a Google image search, MVP standing for minimum viable product. You're going to see the same diagram over and over and over again. Now, it's essentially the same thing, just with different graphics, different drawings, but it's telling the same story over and over again. And I want to explain this diagram to you and what it means to me. If you're going to build a car, it'd be unusual for you to have a long-term vision of how that car was going to be fully formed, and that you were planning in the long term that it was going to have an engine and sound system and climate control, and you build the whole thing, and then you start with a wheel and two wheels and a body and a car. That's not typically how these things work. And furthermore, if somebody just wanted to move faster, they might not need the sound system or the climate control, and they wouldn't necessarily be satisfied with that end result. What if we focus more on the goal and not necessarily the end result, not the product, but focus more on the goal? Does a skateboard help you move faster? Yes, it does. And you can ask somebody, does this help you move faster? And then you can provide them with a scooter. You can make a small modification to it and say, does this help you move faster? Why, yes, it does. And a bicycle, does that help you move faster? Yes, it does. And a motorcycle, and a car, and so on, making these small successive iterations until you arrive at your final product. And that's the difference between this sort of approach when it comes to tools and pipeline and software development, where there's a big plan that's made, and the decision is made and mapped out in a waterfall chart to deliver with a long-term roadmap all of these different features over time, which at the end of the day might not actually be what the people need. And worse yet, and this happens often, unfortunately, in software development in general, but also in a game engine tools development, is there is not enough of an understanding of what people want and what's going to be useful for them, what their goals are. And a lot of development time is spent to develop things that at the end are not helping the users achieve their goals. They're just delivering features. That's a feature-driven approach, where you're developing things that you're not sure people really need, or if it's the highest priority. What we want to try to do is to take this more in a goal-driven approach, in focusing on the goal that the users are trying to accomplish and trying to deliver a series of successive deliverables, and to give us an opportunity to put those in front of people, focus on a specific goal, see if that helps them accomplish their goal, and then move on to the next step. The way that works is like this. It's okay for us to have this long-term design, this whiteboard sketch that maps out the long-term vision of the product. That's something that helps us to plan. Designing these things and doing wireframes is really useful for planning. But then we want to try to understand what is the goal of the user, the main goal, and try to carve out a small piece of that design and just deliver that to them and put it in front of them and do the Genji Genbutsu, to go and see for ourselves how they react to it as soon as possible. Not waiting months and months for them to play with it, but giving them the smallest possible piece of that design and getting it into their hands and seeing how they react to it. And we like to call that our skateboard. And once we do that, we can get there, go and see for ourselves. We can go and get feedback from them and understand how they react to that. And if it's positive, then we can move on to the next chunk and add that in. And then see for ourselves how they're reacting to that and the next chunk, and so on and so on and so on. And how we break this down is really important. Breaking it down into lots of small pieces and on a consistent basis, putting it in front of people and getting their feedback is crucial to developing a product that is going to provide a positive developer experience. And you continue on until you get to your final product. Now, one of the things that I want to talk about is not necessarily how we slice up those pieces, or what the skateboard or the scooter or the motorcycle, etc. is. What I really want to talk about actually is what's not there. I want to talk about the spaces in between. The spaces in between each of those steps are what's really interesting, because when we get to those parts, when we finish that piece and we put that tool in front of people, it's when we can make a decision that's going to lead us three different ways. We can make a decision to do one of three things, and that is either to continue, to pivot, or to switch. Now, I want to talk to you about continue first. In the case of Rainbow Six Siege, as you probably know, Rainbow Six is a game that is heavily based on destruction. You can destroy almost anything in the environment, and this requires really sophisticated destruction tools. And they're rather technical and rather complicated. And one of the things that the team wanted to do was to try to make a version of the tool that was more accessible for other types of people, for less experienced developers and any artist who's never worked with destruction before, to find some way for them to author destruction in the environment, as opposed to it being solely on the shoulders of very a small, limited number of advanced technical destruction artists. So one of the things that we did was we did that long-term whiteboard sketch, or in this case, we did it in Balsamic, which is a tool for sketching out user interfaces and user experience, a user interface or UX proposal. And all of these sketches represent an enormous amount of work if we were going to develop that whole thing from start to finish. Just like developing that car from start to finish and putting in things like the radio and the air conditioning without knowing if that's something that people really want. There was part of this proposal that we didn't know that people really wanted, and so it would have been a bad idea for us to go ahead and implement the whole thing without first understanding if this is how people want to work and if they understand these concepts. Now, the idea of the tool, as I said, basically was to simplify destruction. And what our skateboard was to be able to provide people with recipes to be able to destroy parts of the environment. And so they would select an object and they would click on the recipe, and then it would apply that recipe to the object. Now, the long-term vision of the product was to be able to create these recipes, author them, share them, edit them. But instead, for our skateboard, we just provided one small piece to people. We pre-built our own recipes, and we provided those recipes to people and allowed them to apply them to objects so that we could go and see for ourselves how people reacted. Now, fortunately for us, people reacted in a positive way, and they said that this was a very simple way that they wanted to apply destruction, and it was in the right direction, which allowed us to feel confident that we could continue on with that design and move on to the next step, which would be after evaluating with people, which would be the next step, which would be, for example, the scooter, which would be another piece of the design, and so on and so forth, until we get to our full design, but validating every step of the way with the users. And so that final product, that final design here, as you can see, allows you to select an object and then apply a destruction recipe to it and see it break in the environment. So that's continue. And I want to talk to you about pivot. Now, we can imagine if we were to go back to our analogy, let's take one step back from that and imagine that we started with a roller skate. Now, if we had a roller skate, we might provide that to people and develop essentially some wheels to attach onto something that exists already, let's say some shoes. And we could ask people, does that help you move faster? And is this what you want? And some of them might say, yes, but I need to take my feet off a bit faster. I don't want to be attached permanently to these wheels. So we could develop a board and do something like a skateboard. Or we could do something like get feedback like, well, yes, I like it, but I want to go faster and I want to be higher up. So you might develop something more like a unicycle. Now, the point is that we've pivoted from one option to the other. We've chosen one path or another path. And the path that we take is going to determine what kind of feedback we get and what the user is going to be able to do. In the case of the skateboard, they have these smaller wheels and a board, and that might lead us to adding a handle with a scooter, or it might lead us to realizing that in this user's particular situation, they are, for example, no longer on roads. Things change very fast in the games industry. They might, instead of being on roads, now things have changed and they might actually be on water. And maybe we can take those wheels off, but reuse the board. And what they need is something more like a skateboard to address their current situation. Or in the case of the unicycle, it turns out that people want to travel faster and want more stability, so maybe a bicycle is more appropriate. But again, the importance of going out and understanding, go and see for yourself and see the user situation. We might pivot towards something like this. We don't realize that, in fact, users have a certain disability, for example, or a limitation, and we need to provide something more like a wheelchair as opposed to a bicycle. But at each step of the way, we're testing it, putting it in front of people, and preserving one small piece of that, but pivoting away from that design and shifting to something slightly different. Now, to go back to our example from Rainbow Six, we had developed this early prototype of the tool, and we wanted to try to make a very small window so that people could keep this little tool in the corner, this little the window for this tool in the corner, and to be able to apply destruction to their objects. Um, but uh, uh, but we had the problem that basically what we needed to do was to allow people to select sub objects of an object here, for example. So in the case of the table, we had legs on the table as well as the surface. We wanted to allow people to apply different destruction recipes to the legs relative to the table surface. Now, we wanted people to be able to click on them, but we also wanted people to be able to navigate up and down the hierarchy, because sometimes there are objects that are nested within objects. And so we wanted to be able to provide people with buttons to be able to travel up and down the hierarchy to be able to select sub-objects in there. Now, we had these ideas of putting these buttons in to be able to have you go up and down in the hierarchy. We had done some prototypes, some quick sketches. These things really don't take a lot of time. You can see here some buttons. You can enable the sub-object mode and then click. These are buttons to go up and down from the parent to the child, and then apply one of those recipes to it. And so, of course, we had done this prototype. We'd done that early UI, and we wanted to put it in front of people and see what they thought about it. And so that was our skateboard. And we put it in front of people, and it was a massive failure. People didn't understand the tool. They didn't understand how to navigate. They didn't want to work this way. And moreover, this was something that was very different for them. They didn't quite understand this approach. This was not how they were accustomed to working. And so this was not a great solution at all. So what they really preferred and what they were accustomed to was working with a hierarchy view. And we'd sort of assumed that people wanted to have a smaller window. But in talking to them, we realized that they were perfectly happy with having a slightly larger window as long as we were able to present the objects hierarchy in a way that was understandable by them and didn't require all these extra buttons. And so imagine what we'd done is we were able to get early feedback on that, and instead of going towards, let's say, pivoting towards the scooter, we pivoted more towards the surfboard. It was not what we expected, but it was important for their situation. Based upon understanding their needs, we were able to provide the right solution for them. And this is important because imagine that over time we had never gotten feedback and we'd built the rest of the tool all on top of this understanding that people want a smaller window and they want to use these buttons to be able to go up and down in the hierarchy. That was not true in the case of all the users we tested. And the only way to know that was to carve off this small piece of the tool, develop it quickly, put it in front of them, and get their feedback on what it's like to use. So that's Pivot. And last but not least, let's talk about Switch. Now, over time, as I said, when you're developing that car, the challenge with it is that you're spending a lot of time getting to this final product that in the end it's possible that nobody really wants, and that it's too much for some people, or it has things they don't need. Some people might say, you know, I really wish that you just provided me with a bicycle. That would have been enough to help me go faster, and I didn't need this AM/FM radio or this air conditioner or whatever. Just needed to be able to go a bit faster. And that means, first of all, that it would take a lot less time before you can provide them with something that they can use, but also that you can save that time, the time and resources that you would have spent developing, going all the way to the car, and developing something different instead. You could have developed something else that would have been more useful for them. And that's what Switch is all about. And to show you an example of that, this is an asset browser that we developed within Ubisoft for the Far Cry franchise, which is now being used across a bunch of other productions as well. But it's an asset browser that allows you to find assets in the game and place them in the environment. Now, as an asset browser, as you can imagine, you have lots of different categories of objects, and sometimes there are so many categories that you want to be able to bookmark different sort of search filters that you did when you were searching in a certain folder. You want to show just the models that are in this folder with a certain name, so you want to add a bookmark for that. Now, when you click on the bookmarks button, you get all these different bookmarks, which is perfectly usable, and that's fine. But also you might want to manage those bookmarks. At the bottom right, you can see here this Manage button that you can click on to be able to manage your bookmarks. Now, what would you imagine you would see if you were to click on that? Keeping in mind that managing bookmarks is not something that people do very often, but you might expect to have a bookmark manager in the same way as you would in Firefox or in Chrome. And it's something that we could have decided to do. We could have decided to spend the resources on taking that bookmark menu beyond just being able to add bookmarks, but also being able to manage and rename and reorganize. But we decided in that particular case to make a slight change and to provide only a Windows Explorer window. Now that Explorer window allows you to create folders, rename them, rename bookmarks, and reorganize them in the same way that any other bookmark manager would allow you to, but the difference is that this one is basically free. We're just using the Windows Explorer that people already know. And it may not be a bookmark manager in the traditional sense of a browser, but it was good enough to be able to provide the bookmark management features to people who needed them, which was not a very large number of people. So with that bookmark manager in place, the important thing is that it allowed us to switch over to other features. For example, other skateboards. Switching away from the bicycle, which was good enough in terms of the bookmark manager, being able to add bookmarks, being able to switch to them, but without going to the motorcycle or the car, so to speak, by developing a full bookmark manager system. And those skateboards are other things that people would find much more important than having a fully featured bookmark manager system. For example, being able to have a fully 3D view, a preview of the object that you have selected to be able to zoom in and zoom out and see it from every angle in the bookmark, in the asset manager. Or having a search system that allows you to filter by object, by type, by folder, by all sorts of different metadata for that object using a faceted search system, which was much more powerful than the previous system. Or things like having a recent search history for objects that you'd recently searched for, or having thumbnails for all the objects for people who are want to see the objects more visually and quickly, as opposed to clicking on them with a 3D preview. Now, all of these things, we were able to provide a first pass on them. We were able to provide that skateboard, and that time invested was much more useful for the people who were working on the asset browser as relative to having a bookmark manager. Now, the important thing is when we switch over to these other skateboards, so to speak, and develop those other features, we can afterwards then choose to switch back to the motorcycle and the car of the bookmark manager system. In other words, we could choose after those more important things are done. Once the minimum good enough feature set for the bookmark system has been put into place, we can choose to switch back and afterwards develop that for the bookmark manager system for people who have been using the Windows Explorer interface before and that they needed more power. But again, like I said, this is a limited number of people because we could choose to just really maybe not do that. Maybe in the grand scheme of things, when people use the tool and we've been able to put it in front of them, they realize that it's good enough and we don't need to come back to it. But that's something that we can decide later on. But again, like I said, it's possible that that bicycle, in other words, using the Windows Explorer interface, which is already there, which people already know how to use, might be good enough for people, and it allows us to save time and money that we can spend on other things instead. And that's switch. So as I said, when you break down your design into the skateboard and the scooter and the bicycle, et cetera, how you break those down is interesting. But what's also even more interesting is what you do in between those steps. And that's where you can choose to continue, to pivot, or to switch. And that's how UX professionals are helping the teams at Ubisoft and also can help you to prioritize your solutions to those problems. So as I said at the beginning, people think that success is a question of either choosing to succeed or making a decision that's going to lead them to fail. But it doesn't really work that way. It's not that simple. In fact, success is about a series of small failures. And if you're not failing, in fact, you probably should be nervous. And that's one of the reasons why we try to get these tools in front of people as early and as often as possible, so that we can fail and understand how to readjust and redirect towards success. And those different techniques that I spoke about, that's how UX professionals are driving the games industry forward, by finding opportunities and by helping prioritize solutions. And all of those things hopefully will lead to more iterations and more productivity, which will result in better games for you. Thank you very much.